Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be talking about something that can be a little bit tricky. It's a statistical concept, but don't worry, we're not going to make you do any math.
Yeah, it's one of those things that once you see it, you start to realize it's everywhere, and it can really trip you up if you're not careful.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And it really highlights how sometimes our intuition can lead us astray when we're looking at data. We think we're seeing a pattern, but then when we dig a little deeper, the story changes completely.
Like a magic trick almost.
Right. So to really understand what we're talking about today, let's jump into an example. Imagine you're on a hiring committee at a university,
Okay, I can picture it.
and you're trying to decide between two candidates. Dr. A and Dr. B both have really stellar resumes, but you're particularly interested in their publication records.
Makes sense. Publication is everything in academia.
Exactly. Now, Dr. A boasts a 60% acceptance rate to academic journals, which is impressive, but Dr. B is trailing behind at 40.
So on the surface, it seems like Dr. A is the clear winner, right?
Right, that's what you would think initially. But here's where things get interesting. Dr. B points out that if you actually break down their acceptance rates by year, they actually had a higher success rate than Dr. A in both 2010 and 2011.
Well, that changes things.
It does, right?
Yeah.
So now the question becomes, who should get the job?
Yeah, it's not so clear-cut anymore.
Exactly.
All right.
And this isn't just some theoretical scenario. This is a real dilemma we face all the time when we're trying to interpret data.
Absolutely. We can't just look at the overall numbers. We need to consider the context.
And that's essentially what Simpson's paradox is all about.
It's this idea that a trend can appear in a data set, like Dr. A's seemingly higher overall acceptance rate, but then that trend reverses or even disappears completely when you break down the data into smaller subgroups.
Right, like looking at the acceptance rates for each year individually.
Exactly.
hmm
And it highlights how averages can be deceiving.
It's so important to remember that because we encounter averages all the time in our daily lives.
All the time. And it's easy to take them at face value without digging a little deeper.
Right. So the takeaway here is always ask yourself, does this trend hold true for everyone, or are there hidden groups where the story might be different?
Because often there are.
Okay, so to illustrate this even further, let's look at another example. This one comes from the medical field. Let's say researchers are testing a new drug, and the overall data shows that higher dosages are linked to higher recovery rates.
Okay, sounds promising.
It does, right? But here's the catch. If we analyze the data separately for male and female patients, we might find that the higher dosage is actually associated with lower recovery rates for both genders individually.
Wow, that flips the script.
Right. It's a complete reversal of what we thought was true when we looked at the data as a whole.
It's a classic case of the big picture not telling the whole story.
Right.
Right? The higher dosage seems effective overall, but when you zoom in on those subgroups, men and women, you get a completely different result.
So basically what you're saying is we can't always trust those top-level statistics.
Exactly. We need to be careful about drawing conclusions without considering the potential impact of hidden subgroups.
Okay, so how about some real-world examples of this? Where else does Simpson's paradox rear its head?
Let's take the idea of the hot hand in basketball. Have you heard of that?
Oh, yeah. It's like when a player makes a few shots in a row and they're suddenly unstoppable.
Exactly. It's this belief that past success makes you more likely to succeed in the future. And it seems intuitive, right?
Yeah, you feel like they're on a roll.
But here's the thing. When researchers actually analyze game data, taking into account all sorts of factors like player skill shot difficulty, defensive pressure, the hot hand effect often disappears.
So you're telling me those streaks of amazing shots are just statistical flukes?
In many cases, yeah.
Mm.
It's more likely a combination of skill opportunity and a bit of luck.
Huh. Interesting. So it's not always about being in the zone.
Not necessarily.
Huh.
Our brains are great at finding patterns even when they're not really there.
Speaking of patterns and our brains tricking us, our source material mentioned another example that I thought was fascinating. Changing answers on multiple choice tests.
Oh yeah, that's a classic one.
Right? I was always taught to go with my gut instinct and never change my answer.
It's common advice, but statistically speaking, it's often wrong.
Really? How so?
Studies have shown that for many people, changing an answer on a multiple choice test is actually more likely to result in a higher score.
That's counterintuitive. Why would that be?
Well, think about it. If you're unsure about an answer and you decide to change it, you've probably put more thought into the question, considered different perspectives.
So it's not just randomly switching it up, there's a thought process behind it.
Exactly. And that more deliberate approach can lead to a better outcome.
So Simpson's paradox is all around us. It's in sports, it's in education. Is there anywhere it doesn't apply?
Well, the point is it can pop up anywhere. data is
Oh.
involved, but it's often hidden beneath the surface.
That makes it even more important to be aware of it then.
Absolutely. And to remember that our intuition can be misleading when it comes to statistics.
Okay, so let's talk about one more example from our source material, the famous Berkeley admissions case.
Oh yeah, that one's a classic illustration of Simpson's paradox.
Right. If I remember correctly, the initial data seemed to suggest a bias against women in their admissions process.
Yeah, that was the big headline. The overall numbers did show that men had a higher acceptance rate to Berkeley than women.
But then things got more complicated, right?
Exactly. They had to dig deeper and look at the admissions data for each department separately.
And what did they find when they did that?
Well, it turned out that in many departments, women were actually being admitted at higher rates than men.
So there was no gender bias after all.
Well, it was more nuanced than that. The initial perception of bias vanished when they took into account that departmental breakdown.
So how could it look like there was bias both for and against women at the same time? What was going on there?
Well, it turned out women were more likely to be applying to departments that had lower acceptance rates overall.
So it wasn't that they were being unfairly rejected from departments with higher acceptance rates?
Right. It was more about which departments they were applying to in the first place.
Okay, so it seems like the real culprit here was not considering all the relevant factors.
Exactly. And this is why Simpson's paradox can be so tricky to spot. It often highlights underlying patterns and relationships that aren't immediately obvious.
So how can we avoid falling prey to this statistical illusion? What can our listeners do to become more Simpsons paradox savvy?
Well, first and foremost, be skeptical of data, especially when it's presented as a simple average or an overall trend.
Don't just take it at face value.
Right. Dig a little deeper. Ask questions. Is there more to the story?
Are there hidden subgroups that might change the picture?
Exactly. And whenever possible, try to visualize the data. See if you can spot any patterns or clusters that might be masked by the aggregate view.
That's a great point. Sometimes actually seeing the data laid out visually can make all the difference.
It can. And don't be afraid to break down the data further. Look at it from different angles. Ask what-if questions. What if we group the data by age, by gender, by location? Does the trend still hold true?
So it's all about being curious and asking those critical questions.
Exactly, because the more we question the data, the less likely we are to be fooled by Simpson's paradox.
And remember, this isn't about becoming a statistics whiz. It's about being a more informed and discerning consumer of information.
Absolutely. We encounter statistics every day in the news, on social media, even in casual conversation.
And it's easy to get swept up in those headlines and sound bites without really thinking critically about the data behind them.
Exactly. But by being aware of Simpson's paradox, we can start to look beyond those surface-level statistics and develop a deeper understanding of the world around us.
Well said. I think that's a great note to end on. Remember, everyone, the next time you come across a statistic that seems too good to be true, or maybe just a little bit too simplistic, think about Simpson's paradox. That seemingly obvious truth might just be an illusion, waiting to be shattered by a deeper dive into the data.
And that deeper dive can be incredibly rewarding. It can challenge our assumptions, broaden our perspectives, and ultimately lead us to a more nuanced understanding of complex issues.
Couldn't agree more. So until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and never be afraid to dig a little deeper.